Okay, so we are in a new episode of Late Night Anarchy, and we have as guest as Mila Ghorayeb, which is a grad student at political theory at McGill University, and has been writing, being very active in social media about several issues. And so, how you became interested in political theory? How you
Um, so that's a really fun story. I actually started off in arts and sciences in undergrad. So I started off going to do cognitive science. I went from that to doing philosophy, which is kind of like it has relation to cognitive science because I did philosophy of mind. After that, I by chance took a political theory elective with this professor named Jacob T. Levy, who's well known in a lot of political circles, from what I hear. I really enjoyed political theory, and I thought that it was where my interests sort of intersected because um, I had an interest in politics and an interest in philosophy. So I had an interest in politics since I was in about fifth grade when the Iraq War started. My family is Middle Eastern. They're very political people. So I just heard people swearing at George Bush around the house. And that's kind of like my intro to politics. So I'd always been interested in politics and I was interested in philosophy, and political theory is kind of where that intersected. So I did my undergrad in philosophy and political science, and now I'm doing my master's in political
So, I mean, how you will describe politically, and then why that so many libertarians have been following you?
So I think some of it is by chance. I mean, some of it not. Basically, I did my undergrad thesis under Jacob T. Levy, who is kind of known in libertarian circles. He published a book recently on rationalism, pluralism, and freedom. And so I'd always like had him as an academic influence, even though we don't agree on a lot of things. But yeah, so I was acquainted with him, but I had also become acquainted with another person who ran the sort of Students for Liberty chapter at McGill. So we became friends, and I was running a club at the time called Free Thought McGill. So Free Thought was a secular humanist club that we sort of like became friends with the Liberty students, even though again, like I didn't agree with them on everything, but we kind of hosted an event that Professor Levy spoke at. Um, and the event wasn't overly partisan. It was about Charlie Hebdo um, and about free speech, but it wasn't one of those like clunky, brute libertarian free speech talks. It was more about say like Islamophobia in France and that relation between that to free speech. So, so in that sense, you know, we kind of intersected on a lot of issues, and at the same time, I think I became friends with a lot of libertarians through sort of muting the differences and uh, playing on our similarities, which is sort of ending like the war on drugs everywhere, legalizing everywhere, ending mass incarceration, ending uh, needless U.S. interventions, U.S. imperialism abroad. So, I mean, we kind of diverge on certain aspects, but as Lenin would say, uh, Leninists are 9/10 anarchists. So you know, we just disagree on how to get there. So there's a lot more overlap than people think, but there definitely
Yeah,
are fundamental differences as well.
I mean, when I started to write in an American publication, it was in Counterpunch, and if it's true that by the time I sent the articles I wrote there, uh, the Alexander Kober was passed some years ago, but he was kind of that kind of effort to merge like libertarianism and Marxism, even the most orthodox aspects of it. It was kind of crazy, and yeah, it's kind of wild. I mean, I came to libertarianism in a very strange kind of manner because um, I was studying philosophy, which has a lot to do with political theory, and I was and there is no one libertarian in any philosophy department in Peru, or by that matter, even political science or even economics. I mean, there is a guy who likes Buchanan, but it's very right, not much libertarian. But so I was reading an Argentinian philosopher who was very interested in Foucault, and he was also interested in a free market anarchist that was called Carl Hess. And when I started to read him, he was like very left wing and very sympathetic to the market, and it was very strange because despite that I have considered my whole life someone on the left, I had some kind of weird sympathies for a market that were kind of strange, and in that regard, I continue to have this kind of sympathies. And it was very funny because there was an event about the militias of the 60s in many parts of the world. The most known militias are the Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Army, but there were militias before in Peru, and there were different. They were less like it wasn't interested in committing terrorist acts, but in overthrowing their government was their priority. And this kind of militias have a one of the members was speaking about the new left, because then after serving jail time, he became interested in most electoral politics. But the guy was saying something that it strikes me as very surprising. He was saying that the true goals of the left should be establish a true free market, and that communities especially indigenous communities will benefit much of it than others. And it was kind of that language that closer to what left libertarians argue, that they're a true free market. That we don't want to see corporations um, and big state structures, and it's something that has kind of interested me and make me go into that strange kind of path.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um I guess like my concern would not be with the free market just like existing in a vacuum. But I think like the issue is like sort of first of all what you said about the market benefiting the indigenous people was a very common argument used during the mandate system under the League of Nations, and how uh, sort of that free market ideals were kind of intertwined with uh, Western imperialism. So I guess like for me, I'm primarily above all an anti-imperialist, and if there's going to be like capitalist or sort of market ideals embedded into that, then that's what I want to remove as to basically or dismantle imperialism. I don't know a lot about Peru. I mean, my focus is Middle East, so I mean, I have a lot to learn in that respect. But uh, yeah, I mean, I was actually I did an AMA in a group of libertarians about 2 3 weeks ago, and a lot of people asked me similar questions about sort of like say companies are being subjected to the sort of say capricious will of your boss or your livelihood being subjected to the boss. And I think this is what Marxists are concerned about. They're concerned about when the circumstance in which you have nothing else to sell but your labor. And so what Marxists, especially ones who are more on the libertarian socialist side, want to emphasize is the way that capitalism is an affront to them. And I think that's the main concern that people can work their differences out over, because we still ended up having a very civil discussion about it. So I think things were more points of agreement than not. I say this among more left sort of C4SS crowds than say right libertarians who I have literally nothing in common with.
Yes, I suppose to a certain point. I guess that I largely agree. For example, don't like the term classic liberalism because I mean, some libertarians have pointed the same issue, that the ideas of classic liberalism has to do with Western imperialism, and that as imperialists, one libertarians should be opposed to that. And it's very funny because not only not only left libertarians are making that point. I mean, the former editor of the American Conservative, which was working in the in the Ron Paul campaign back in some years ago, he actually made the case that liberalism means empire, and that even classic liberalism means empire. So even if someone has a classic liberal regime, it will still be war and violence and destruction. And the funny thing is that there is an interview in RT about with Ron Paul, and Ron Paul was saying that he doesn't like the term capitalism because the term capitalism is now means crony capitalism, and as Ron Paul, I don't like to use the word capitalism, and never had much sympathy, because I think that libertarians waste too much time defending a war that in many cases don't resembles what they want, really, because today, like the what is known as capitalism is not even what Adam Smith think about it. There's a very interesting professor of political theory at the University of Virginia, Deborah Bukuyanis, who was saying that even Adam Smith wasn't arguing about the, how to put it this way, that the markets don't justify difference, that the markets should have equality as a goal, that inequality is actually rooted in the interference in the market by the hand of the state, but so especially conservative politicians use every day the term free market or pro market to allow inequalities to rise and don't do anything about it.
Yeah, I think so. I think the relationship here is, or what the key variable here is private property. So when I use the term capitalism, I refer to the private ownership of the means of production. And so this can be seen as a driver of inequality, but I don't think that capitalism refers to inequality in and of itself. I think it just entails inequality to function. So the issue with inequality is not that it's inherently bad. The issue with it is that it is a barrier to freedom for like a large majority of people. Because if you have like, it is a form of unfreedom for you to be subjected to the will of another person to subsist in such a way that you are in capitalism. If your boss is making 300 times more than you are, then that's what people are concerned about. And that inequality is perpetuated because capital is concentrated in like a small group of people. So I think the ways in which people connect it to free market ideals is also ideals of private property. But what people don't understand, I was talking to some libertarians once about private property, and somebody took my hat off and ran away with it. Said, "Oh, well, I guess you don't believe in private property." And I was just thinking, like, there's a difference between private and personal property. So private property refers to the means of production. Personal property is things like your toothbrush. I joke about it, but I'm not going to take away people's toothbrush in the revolution or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, I mean, it's true. I mean, there is a lot of caricatures about Marxism, and I will say that in Latin America, the most anti-state beyond the anarchists are fairly the Marxists, because the libertarians in Latin America are fairly right-wing, sadly. I mean, there
Right.
are one of or two like left libertarians, and there are some libertarians that are more on the center, I will say. But generally, the libertarian movement is fairly right-wing, and as pointed out some by the Intercept, actually, it has curiously and strangely received funds from the U.S. government, and I guess that's something that I have worry. That's I guess the reason why I have more contact with the people on the libertarian movement outside Latin America. Also, I should be more in contact with the few left libertarians that are here, so they are quite idiosyncratic in many ways. So they have had problems more serious than I with the more regular left and with the more regular right. I think there is a story about a guy in the C4SS, the Centro for Civil Society, a Brazilian guy who go to a march with an anti-Dilma march and was attacked because he was a left libertarian, and it was very strange. This kind of issues that I guess the libertarian movement is not unified in many ways. But I was wondering to the point of the more of the convergence. There is a lot of talk the about Rothbard left wing phase, and that in that times he was an ally of the Maoists and many people on the New Left, and in that period he developed a vision from libertarianism had some to deal with a vision of Marxism, an international movement that seeks a revolution, is to say in some way. And I think that what has happened after that is that libertarianism was come weak for several reasons. I guess that one of the strong reasons that it became weak was in the 90s. There was kind of neoliberalism is still a lot of its standard. It achieved some things that libertarians were calling to achieve, and it do in a more rapid way. So people with market-friendly ideas became neoliberals or sympathetic to neoliberalism, and the most orthodox and radical libertarianism is like lost a lot of its fire. And at the same time, the left libertarians were in a huge crisis because Carl Hess died, and Robert Anton Wilson was doing his own thing, and other left libertarians were the less known left libertarians were doing other things. So it was like um, a very like a crisis. And when Ron Paul appears, he has a libertarian message, but his message was fairly more nationalistic in some way. He was talking about the founding fathers, about the issues that has more concern to America, not to all the world. Although he had some resonance overseas, but how you do that comparison? It's do you think that that's the tension in present authoritarianism, that Marxism generally has aspired to certain international movement, and libertarianism is in some ways trapped into being a regional movement, mostly in the United States or in English-speaking countries?
I think that libertarianism is definitely more indebted to a sort of Western philosophy. I mean, Marx was obviously a Western philosopher as well, but I think that just like leftist ideas, have like leftist movements have flourished in, say, the global South, um, or like colonized countries, because I think that it actually can work with anti-colonial nationalist movements, and I think we've kind of seen evidence of that in a lot of ways. I don't think that it's necessarily a sort of nationalist versus sort of internationalist movement, but I think that it's very contextual in terms of like what people are fighting. So, for instance, because Marxism is very like it holds a very anti-imperialist, and I think it's very inherently anti-colonial, especially because imperialism sort of relies on capitalism in a lot of ways. I think that for that reason, Marxist movements sort of flourish in colonized states. So, for instance, I was just reading a book that had the documents of the PFLP, who was a Marxist-Leninist group in Palestine, and they actually argue, okay, so we can't talk about our struggle without talking about world imperialism, and we can't talk about world imperialism without talking about Arab capitalism and like the ways in which capitalist and Arab states are connected to like sort of the subordination of Palestine. And so I think in that way, I think I can see why liberation movements are sort of tied to Marxism-Leninism, whereas I think libertarianism is very, I mean, I think of like the origin of, say, classical liberalism. I kind of pinpointed to people like John Locke, who I know a lot of libertarians reject nowadays because he works in this sort of natural rights framework that not a lot of people take. But I think that he sort of started a lot of these ideas. And the thing is about Locke's ideology is that it was also very colonial. And so I can see also why it doesn't really stretch out to states that were previously colonized, Middle Eastern states. However, there are definitely leaders, but again, usually the people who are libertarians or classical liberals in their personal ideology that I've seen in studying the Middle East have been sort of allied with Western powers. So, for instance, in Lebanon, we have the Hariri family, who son Saad is the prime minister right now, and his father was the prime minister before him. I mean, they are like self-identified classical liberals, but they're pretty like they're backed by Saudi Arabia. They have businesses in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is a U.S. ally. And I think that like Arab capitalism, especially in Saudi Arabia, has a sort of like explicit alliance. Well, it's a tacit and an explicit alliance with the United States. And so I think like that's what libertarian, again, like it's a more crude libertarianism. I don't think people talk about left libertarianism much over there.
Yes. No, I was going to ask you about, you were saying about nationalism, and I was just, this last year I was reading a curious article in Crime about the several movies that were made last year in South Korea about anarchism. And it was very strange because the story of South Korea, anarchism is very valid because there was an anarchist who made terror attacks in Japan in times of the occupation, and he even have monuments. I mean, it's very strange because when one thinks in anarchists, don't think that they will end up having monuments built by one state. But he was saying that the author of the article was saying that his anarchism also merged with the kind of anti-communism that deals in Korean, in the South Korean nationalism and even capitalism. So anarchism became like a, I mean, it's not viewed as bad as Marxism, I guess, in South Korea, what he was trying to say, at least in popular representations in culture and that kind of regards. But I was wondering, what's your take on the issue of the sometimes conflict between anarchists and Marxists? Because I was once hear an anarchist saying that he was saying that there was at some point back in some years ago, there was an idea among some anarchists to not only have anti-fascist organizations but also anti-tanky organizations, which were kind of strange. Like to take.
First of all, I don't think the word tanky is very useful. I mean, like, I don't even know what it refers to be honest. Like, I know if it refers to Stalin, if it like, I just feel like it doesn't really mean anything. I haven't really heard it successfully refer to anyone in particular. Where I think Leninism and anarchy, like, so Lenin is actually very anti-state, and I use Lenin here because I think theoretically he has provided the most in terms of what is to be done with the state and what is to be done with anarchist ideals versus Marxist ideals. So as I said earlier, like Lenin talks about being sort of 9/10 an anarchist, and the reason is as you know, Lenin believes in this sort of transitional stage where there's a temporary sort of dictatorship, and I use scare quotes for that, dictatorship of the proletariat, because I think this is a very misunderstood theory that even I personally misunderstood until like I took a grad seminar in which I read Lenin with a Marxist philosopher. So I basically, Lenin expects that the state will sort of wither away, but right now, just as things are, there are certain oppressive structures that hold very like entrenched hierarchies with like class hierarchies, racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies in place. So if we were to say abolish the state right away, Lenin thinks it would just kind of come back because we still have all of the, so basically like he does also distrust the state. I mean, he sees the state as like this sort of instrument of the ruling class, and the state is built through a series of oppressive structures, so like patriarchy, racism, classism. So all of these things will just come back if we abolish the state right away, because we haven't abolished the class hierarchies or the class antagonisms that give rise to the state in the first place. So what Lenin wants to do is sort of use the mechanisms in place. That's why he also believes in retaining some of the old regime's public officials, but limiting their power, limiting their reach. And he believes in this sort of transitional stage where, like, again, this is a little vague because I don't know exactly what it's supposed to entail, but there is a sort of way in which we need to sort of use the tools that we have to dismantle the oppressive structures in place. And then we can expect that the state does not have what nourishes the state anymore. And so the state won't be what we conceive of a state to be right now. So I think that's where the difference is. But I don't know. I don't think that this difference is a deal breaker between the two. I don't think it's like a sort of end of the world kind of thing. I think it's just like just a matter of time, or like they just believe in different timelines. But I don't think that, say, like the goals are so far from each other that they're not reconcilable.
Well, speaking about unjust structures, so we could move to the discussion about the Palestinian Israel conflict, and I mean, it has been exacerbated by the Trump administration, but it was more or less the peace talks and what we have. I mean, it has been like even if Bernie would have been elected, I think it would have been very complex to move in the issue, because it's very, I mean, as long as the United States will have its back solidly, it seems very difficult, at least in the short time, to see a significant move. And with Trump, things are even worse now.
I can still hear you, but I think my face froze. But no worries. So yeah, as far as Israel goes, I mean, this is an occupation that has lasted longer than what everyone has expected. It's very like I don't know how sustainable it's going to be. And I think that a sort of two-state solution is probably not viable at this point, simply because there's been too many settlements in Palestinian areas. And so if there was to be a two-state solution, you'd have to expel all of the settlers in the Palestinian areas, which is it's not feasible. And also, I don't believe in expelling anyone from any area at all. And so another thing is that, I mean, there's some very extreme rhetoric on my side of things that I also don't agree with. And what I mean is in discourse among Arab leaders, there's I mean, I've just been watching the speeches of Hassan Nasrallah for research only, but basically he says, okay, well, these Jewish people, they're not indigenous to the Middle East, they can go back to Russia, whatever. That I don't agree with either. I think that obviously expulsion from anywhere, any place is very contrary to my ideals. But that's also why I think that the right of return is necessary, simply because as an open borders advocate, I can't really like say, okay, well, you should be prevented from coming here. But I think that because of both of those views, I don't, and because of the fact that so many settlements are in place, I really don't think that a two-state solution is going to happen. So instead, what's going to have to happen is a one-state solution where we all learn to live with each other. That's very idealistic. I don't know when that will happen, but I think that there's effectively been, a few nails in the coffin.
Yes, I mean it seems like it's like that. I mean, the deal is that it's very difficult to move in any direction significantly if there's with so much settlements. I think even Francis Fukuyama has mentioned that, I guess.
Not my favorite guy, but
no, but he sometimes, yeah, it's very strange. I mean, Francis Fukuyama is the case of weird political scientists which became relatively famous in outside circles, and this singer, Australian singer Yesalea, was saying that one of her hit pop songs was inspired by reading his book on political order. It was very weird. It's a very cheesy kind of pop song, but it's strangely inspired by the kind of strange realism that Fukuyama now promotes. But to move to the issue of Ahad Tamini, which has it has become a really curious issue because the Palestine-Israel conflict don't has that much coverage in Latin America, I guess for different reasons. But this case has been relatively prominent here, and especially after when Lourdes said that she was not going to perform, that the news was in a lot of places. I think that maybe the news wants to put that song because it was kind of cheesy. And anyway, but even of that, they started talking about BDS. So it was kind of strange because I don't know what the real consequence of Ahad Tamini imprisonment are going to be. Will she become a symbol of the Palestinian resistance? What form of demonization will the Israeli right make of her? Does the BDS movement could take a new position on, and not a new position, but maybe be in a different shape than it has been now, especially since the move of the capital to Jerusalem. the embassy to Jerusalem. So it's like many questions that I don't know if you think this kind of developments will have any nearby solution.
So there's a few things in here. I think that Ahad's case has definitely stretched beyond BDS, or like the BDS movement's scope. I mean, I think everybody's talking about it. Unfortunately, I think one of the reasons why people are talking about it more is that she's more of a sympathetic looking figure to Americans passing Arab. But at the same time, I think that also because she's Arab, she has been racialized as violent. So in one sense, I'm not super optimistic because there's a lot of outlets that I've actually, it's made me a little more cynical because there's been a lot of outlets that have been justifying the detainment, and it does not look like a pleasant detainment. Detainment of a minor, and so the thing is, in say like critical race theories, when we talk about racialized people, especially racialized minors, we talk about how those who are racialized are seen as they're not seen as innocent in any meaningful way, even if they are young. So there's a ton of child prisoners in Israel, but yet they're still seen as violent. They're still seen as a threat. Whereas a sort of, say, a young American kid in jail, this would be seen as more cruel, and they'd be seen as more innocent. So I'm kind of not optimistic in the sense that I think there's a lot of racial tropes that are still flourishing in this case, because we see what her actions being reported as assault. We see people trying to bring up the Tamimi family as having a violent history, which essentially just means they live in a very harsh reality, in a very harsh condition under occupation. But any attempts they sort of make against that are seen as violent. So I think we still see the same racialized tropes about Arabs being violent people, and so because of that, I don't really think. I think it's getting more people talking about Israel, but I don't think it's necessarily entailing that these people are on our side.
So you were talking on social media about the metaphysics of race and how the case of Ahad Tamini has made people wondering about what's the meaning beyond racial identity, that doesn't that why a look doesn't define a person ethnic or identity or communal identity. How do you tackle that subject?
Yeah, so I have a paper on this and it's kind of unfinished, but I've been meaning to put it out to the public. But basically, when we talk about race, and this is again as someone who does metaphysics of race and metaphysics of gender, we talk about race as a social construct. When we say that race is a social construct, we say that racial divisions are not essential properties. They're lines and demarcations that are drawn. So racial divisions are very dependent on common beliefs about race. They don't wholly coincide with self-identification, because identity is also contingent on who the person is taken to be, as Charles Mills writes. But while race is socially constructed, there's I don't know. So there's a lot of, it's very complicated and it's very fluid, and especially when you're white passing. So white passing is very common among Arabs who live in the Levant because of the colonial history in the Levant, particularly, and the imperial history, particularly the Crusades. So in my essay, I actually talk about this really funny lived example. So I mean, I am a white passing Arab, so that means that uh, every day so I have something called white passing privilege, which means that if I'm just walking down the street, I'm probably not going to be racially profiled as Arab. If someone read my name, then maybe. But if I just by my looks alone, I don't necessarily look like someone that would be targeted, unlike, say, a hijabi woman. So I was in Paris, I think a year ago with my cousin, and we were stopped on the street and asked if we were French Jews.
You were French what?
French Jews, like they asked if we were Jewish.
Uh,
And so, you know, we were not initially racialized as Arab by this stranger because in appearance, we are not what people conceive of as Arab. So eventually my cousin said, no, we're not, we're Lebanese. And all of a sudden the man just changes his tone and he yells, Arab? And he starts following us in like outrage, like he seemed really upset. It turns out he was an IDF guy, so that made more sense. I don't really like Arabs very much, but uh, it means a few things. So first, it means that some people are racialized more easily. That means that they don't need to give much information to be racialized. So for instance, dark-skinned Arabs, hijabi women, they are very immediately racialized as Arabs. They even like if I was wearing a hijab, even though I'm light skinned, the man maybe would still assume that was Arab. So the less stereotypical markers someone has of their racialized group, the less likely they'll be instantaneously identified as a member of that group. Secondly, racialized people are identified as members of a broad social group. So not necessarily genetics or biology. So I mean, among Arabs, like there's this guy who everyone sort of kind of finds a little funny. His name is Nassim Taleb, and he is like he's a mathematician. He's on this mission to prove that Lebanese people are not Arab. He keeps trying to say that no, Lebanese people are Phoenician, and he uses like mathematical statistics to talk about this and refer. And the thing is like, I mean, yes, the Phoenicians were in Lebanon at some point, but Lebanon has been occupied by about 6 different ethnic groups at this point. So yeah, so I mean, let's say that guy who yelled Arab at me. Let's say I turned to him and I said, actually, I'm not Arab, I'm Phoenician. Check out these statistics. I don't really think he would care because to most of the world, Lebanese ethnicity is still seen as Arab or more broadly as Middle Eastern. So no one's going to re-racialize me as Phoenician by a personal request. There's no modern norm or markers of racializing people as Phoenician. So that's what we mean when we say that there's no sort of essential properties of race, in the sense that, I mean, if you DNA tested me, you could probably find some Phoenician DNA, but Phoenician is not a common racial marker. No one refers to anyone as that. It's not on a racial census, so nobody's gonna you know, go by that. So basically, you know, culture is this sort of Charles Mills, who's a philosopher of race, talks about culture as a sort of emanation of biological race. So like there's, yeah, I mean, the last thing that people sort of criticize racial categories for and racial essentialism is that they kind of also try and make it into a psychological determinism that's implied by biological race. So there's, say, like, there's a famous text by Raphael Patai that says that Arabs are like racialized as a homogenous group because of their behavior. he talks about how there's a homogenous Arab psychology that, you know, says that Arabs are prone to conflict and extreme emotion, and makes Arabs unwilling to accept institutional authority, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so that's kind of like the conclusions that racialization takes us to. So I guess in the case of Ahad, so that was a bit of a big tangent. But in the case of Ahad, I mean, she definitely has white passing privilege, probably less so than, say, an Arab living in the West, because I think she's still very uh, identifiably Palestinian via, you know, like she went to a checkpoint. Like there's, I mean, the lived reality there is quite different. She went to a checkpoint, that's it. She's Palestinian. I mean, she lives in Nabi Saleh. So it's a little bit of a different scenario, but yes, I mean, to the external world, everyone suddenly like, wow, what? There's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Arab. I can't believe this. But at the same time, she's still very largely racialized as Arab, in that people are still attributing these essentialized qualities that I just mentioned about, you know, like hot-headedness, prone to conflict, prone to violence. They're still racialized with negative stereotypes that are attached to biological essentialism, that is attached, or that explains Arabness as a sort of essential feature rather than a constructed category.
Well, I mean, yeah, I understand the case because it's true, because I mean, other cases, especially in Latin America, the Israeli, as I was saying, the Palestine-Israeli conflict doesn't have much coverage, but she has, her cases managed to have some kind of coverage after all. And yes, I mean, it's in Latin America, the race ideology has been very important in the development of immigration policies. The immigration policies main concerns of most of Latin American countries, as far as I know, were in the 19th century to promote immigration from European countries, particularly from Northern Europe, and some did that in a more some were more successful, we're saying, in some way. Brazil, in Brazil, there is a lot of German population, and actually the German population has grown so much that it's becoming without lands, and it's going to Paraguay, and the indigenous population of Paraguay don't have much sympathy to the German, Brazilian Germans. In Argentina or Uruguay, there has a lot of immigration from Italy and from other European countries, and it has been like, so it's very curious, like the definitions, for example, when people try to put Latinos as a category, as a racial category, is very complex, because I mean, I walk every day in the streets, and you can see, basically, especially in large cities, people of all colors, and for being born here, there are technically Latinos if they go to the United States, and it's very complex to, and obviously that the term Latino, by coming to from the term Latin to it's also, it doesn't acknowledge the indigenous origins of a large part of Latin American population, because even Argentina, which is in theory the most white, unquote, country of Latin America, a lot of the so-called white population still have indigenous origins, at least partially, and it's very complex to have a discussion of race, and I feel that especially because of how the things have gone in the last years, and especially because of the preponderance of identity politics that has made race a more partisan issue than an issue of proper debate. So
Yeah.
I don't know how you see this kind of swift in this last time about the issue of race.
Yeah, I mean, so identity politics is interesting because, I mean, we have a sort of way of mobilizing and of organizing. For instance, like we have these racial categories and a shared experience of being racialized. Even if these racial categories are constructed, we still have a sense of social solidarity among other people who share the same sort of process of racialization that we undergo. So, in one sense, yes, it's a very good organizational mechanism. On the other sense, obviously, identity politics has limits. Um, I mean, I've definitely seen it go too far in my communities. But I mean, so for instance, like there is a tendency on the left for like in my own circles, I've definitely seen people get sort of abusive almost in and use their identity to justify the abusiveness that they exhibit. So that's definitely not okay. I've also seen it sort of among centrists or like say like Hillary Clinton types that would say, you know, be fine with like a warmongering imperialist capitalist, whatever, so long as they fit the right amount of marginalized identity. Obviously, you know, Marxists are very critical of this, and then when we are critical of it, we get called brocialists, which is definitely, I mean, there's that as an issue as well. There's definitely the other side of things where there are Marxists who are class reductionists and don't account for things like sexism and racism. There's definitely two sides to it. So I guess my take is that you definitely need identity politics to some extent, but we can't abuse it in order to justify other needs.
Yes, in the campaign trail there was something very funny. There was an article about someone. I don't know if the article was, "I am a Marxist feminist and I am voting for Hillary Clinton." And if I'm not wrong, Hillary Clinton retweeted that. It was probably the most moment on the internet, and it was weird. And I mean, it was in the primary, so Bernie was there.
Wow,
It was
that's shocking.
yeah. Someone even did a screenshot of that and then put it in case that she will delete it. But yeah, it was weird. So it has been a very interesting conversation. I hope people that could follow you online. So where they could follow you to read about your your always interesting takes.
Yeah, so I there's a few means in which you can do this. On Facebook, I am an admin of a page called the Middle Eastern Feminist. So you can find that what it's called. On Twitter, I am by MGobes, just MGHOBS. That's basically my two means of communicating with the public. I occasionally publish articles in various McGill publications, but I'll usually post those on my Twitter.
Okay, well, thanks. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.